Oh hi. Kabul, the capital and the largest city of Afghanistan. This city stands on the river Kabul, and is at the height of 1800 meters above sea level. The highway connected to the cities of Ghazni, Kandahar, Herat, Mazar-i-Sharif. In Kabul, ammunition, fabric, furniture, sugar are made. The population of the city makes 42,156 people. 2020 assessment. About origin of the city and its name there are many legends. One of them says, the Padishah's horse sharply stopped. It wasn't farther than a way. Ahead the water smooth surface of the lake on which middle the mysterious island turned green stretched. After short thought the Padishah called the viziers and ordered them to prepare a crossing. From near and far settlements brought a lot of straw, poured out it to the lake, strengthened a flooring and earth layer, and the crossing was ready. Having passed on the straw bridge, on the island the Padishah heard sounds of fine music. On the island there lived the skillful musicians devoting their leisure to music and dances. The Padishah was fascinated by their game. He so liked this valley that he decided to build the city here. In memory of visit of the island he enjoined to call the city of Kabul the Straw Bridge. Command of the Padishah was executed. In the green valley the city grew. Over time the name Kabul turned into Kabul, and the remains of the big lake remained in his vicinities. Among residents of Kabul there is one more interpretation of the name of the city based on the Afghan writing of his name. Water between flowers, that is, the river flowing between the blossoming coast. According to E.M. Ospelev, the city is called from the Gutronym of the same name, which etymology is definitely not established. A city known in ancient times under Kup's name, is mentioned in the Indian religious collection Rigveda and in Avesta, the sacred book of Zoroastrianism. Rigveda praises the city as the perfect place for life in mountains. The city was under the power of Midiates while it wasn't occupied by Achaemenid. On these sources, at the time the city was called already Kaborg. This word was used by the Greek astrologer Claudius Ptolemaeus. This city became the cultural center of Zoroastrianism, Buddhism and Hinduism. Notes of Alexander the Great, who explored the valley after gain, are one more source of the description of the city. However, record can't be considered as reliable as probably Alexander described the nearby small town. Later the region became a part of the Empire of Selevkidov, and then was a part of the Indian Empire of Maurya. In the 2nd century BB Kabul was won from India Greek. To the middle of the 1st century BB the Indo-Scythian kingdom took control of this city. Most likely, the region was mentioned in the Chinese chronicle Tu Huhanj as Gothu. It was the large principality. The people were similar to Indians. We aren't aggressive, good dealers. Got under dependence on Indians, Bactrians, Parthians. However, 100 years later the city passed under the power of the Kashansky kingdom, at government of the Emperor Kadzula Kadphiz. Then the city remained under their power till 3rd century AD. In 230 Kashana suffer a defeat from the Empire of Sasanidev and become the vassal state which voluntarily transferred Kabul to aggressors. In 420 Sassanida were expelled by the tribe of Kidaritav, who in turn in the 460th years were expelled by Aftalita. The city became a part of a Turkic Khaganate Ashina. The city throughout 60 generations Turkic princes will rule. Also the city builds the defensive wall which didn't remain up to now. Some historians attribute to Kabul the Sanskrit name Cambodia and assume that the name of the kingdom came from the city. The city is mentioned in other works as Koves or Kofin. The Chinese monk Xuanzang mentioned the city as Tukov. In the 1st century of our era to the valley of Kabul Yuchizi people, or East Sarmatians in large quantities migrate. The Christianity also begins to get. Islamic invasions reached Afghanistan in 642, then Kabul was independent. The Arab aggressors at first didn't manage to subordinate to Islam, in particular, the commander Abdur Rahman bin Sayman at the end of the 600 years managed to turn all region into Islam of only 12000 locals before leaving the city. Muslims remained in minority before repeated capture of Kabul in 870. Arabs under leadership of Ya'u ibn Lays, who created the first Muslim dynasty in the region. Thus Muslims began to make elite in the city and the region. In Kabul, the fortress well known for the force to which only one road conducts is located. In her there live Muslims, and the city is inhabited incorrect of India. Within the next centuries the city was passed under control by Samanidev, Ghaznavidev, Guridev and Horam-Shafav. In the 1200th years there was the Mongolian invasion. The horde burned and destroyed everything on the way and devastated Kabul. Many sources have mentioned the Massachusetts slaughter arranged with Mongols among local population as revenge for murder of the grandson Genghis Khan. After the Mongolian gain, new states were formed, and Kabul was a part of the Chagatai Ulus. During Mongolo-Tatar invasion many natives of Afghanistan fled to India, extending influence of Islam, and later established the Delhi Sultanate. At Babur, Kabul temporarily became the capital of the state of Great Mughals. Babur is buried in Kabul. The Arab scientist from Morocco described Kabul as follows. Further we went to Kabul. It was once big city, but now this settlement where there lives the tribe from Persians who are called Afghans. They own the cities and passes and have big power. The most part of Afghans robbers. Their biggest mountain is called Kakai Suleiman. Kabul was included into specific possession, created by Timur in 1392 for the grandson Parmakamit. In the 14th century Kabul became large shopping center of the kingdom of Timur. In 1504 the city became the headquarters of the Timuridsky governor of India, Babura. Later the city becomes one of the most important centers of the Empire of Great Mughals. In 1525 Babur described the city and its vicinities as follows. In the Kabul region there live various tribes. In valleys and plains there live Amites, Turkic peoples and Arabs. In the city and some villages there live Sarta tribes, Pashai, Parachi, Tajiks, Labels and Afghani live in other villages and areas. In the mountains of Ghazni there live tribes of the Khazar and Nikadari. Among Hazaras and Nikadarites some speak Mogolsky language. In mountains to the northeast there are settlements of Kafirs, for example, Khadr and Gibrik. In the south, settlements of Afghans. In the Kabul region speak 11 or 12 languages. Arab, Persian, Turkic, Mogolski, Indian, Afghan, Pasha, Parads, Jibber, labels, Lamgan. Mirza Muhammad Haidar, the poet from Hindustan who visited the city in the same time, wrote, "Have dinner and drink in Kabul, it is the mountain, the desert, the city, the river and many other things." Exactly from here Babur in 1526 began gaining the north of India, and the regions won by him underwent Islamization and today are known as Pakistan. Babur, having lived 20 years in Kabul, very much I fell in love with the city and I wished to be buried here. The inscription on his grave is borne by the couplet which became well known. If there is paradise on the earth, then exactly here, exactly here, exactly here. In 1737 the city was occupied by the Iranian master Nader Shah Afshar. However, 9 years later he was killed by own officers, and 1747 Ahmad Shah Durrani, who began to broaden the empire which received the name Durrani-Skoy, came to the power. Actually then Afghanistan close to modern borders was formed. In 1776 Ahmad's son Timur Shah Durrani transferred the capital from Kandahar to Kabul. Timur Shah died in 1793, and to him the son Zaman Shah Durrani inherited him. Then the city was visited by Englishman George Foster, who called Kabul the cleanest city in the southern Asia. Meanwhile the Russian Empire promptly won the Islamic states lying to the north from Afghanistan, and not to ally gain, the British Empire made attempt to establish control over Afghanistan. In 1826 in the city Dost Muhammad governed, but in 1839 as a result of a revolution Shuja Shah Durrani, being upon the puppet of the British Empire and come to the power with her help, came to the power. However, the new Shah ruled not for long and was killed in 1841 by city rebels. After the British made several attempts of military invasion into the country. So in 1842 they took Kabul under control, however again were rejected on the south during a siege under leadership Akbar Khan. The English troops made the second and successful attempt to capture Kabul in 1878. The Peace Gandamuxki Treaty, according to which British gained a foothold in Afghanistan, was signed. However, on September 3, 1879 the Afghan army lifted a revolt against the Emir and crushed the British mission, having killed the ambassador Cavagnari. The Emir requested helps from Britain, and to Kabul the division of the General Roberts was directed. On October 6 Robert broke the Afghan army in battle at Cherasiab near Kabul, and on October 7 approached the city. During fights the British partially destroyed historical fortress Ballahisar. In 1926 the King of Amanullah, at whose government the first electrical equipment is installed in Kabul, comes to the power and education for girls is entered. The king liked to drive about on the city on the British Rolls-Royce limited car, and there lived in the well-known gift palace Ul Aman. After the Third Anglo-Afghan War of Amanul announced independence in the Muscat Gap. In 1929 the king was forced to leave Kabul because of a local revolt, organized Habibullah of Baka, who, however, in 9 months of board was imprisoned in prison by the new king Nader Khan. In 1933 the new king was killed by the student Abdul Halikam during the awards ceremony in school in Kabul. The throne was succeeded by his 19-year-old son Zahir Shah, who governed for several decades. During the pre-war period, France and Germany helped to develop the country and opened new schools with lyceums to support quality education among elite of the country. So, in 1932 in Kabul, the Kabul University opened. The pupils got an education on the Western sample. Most of teachers were the Afghans who got an education in the West. In the 1960th, most of university teachers had diplomas of the Western universities. When Zahir Shah came to the power, in Kabul only 10 km of the railroads were constructed. In the country there were several internal telegraphs, phone lines and roads. Zahir addressed the German, Italian and Japanese engineers with a request for creation in the country of new transport infrastructure and communication network. So, in 1937 in Kabul the first radio tower was constructed that allowed to hold communication with nearby villages. For development of economy, banks and national cartels were created. In Kabul, new cotton mills, power plants and furniture factories which could provide necessary production in the city were constructed. Since 1955 the Soviet Union which constructed in the country the system of public transport, the airports, cement works, bakery, 5 new highways and a dam was engaged in development of infrastructure. The city began to attract a great number of the Western tourists. In 1960 in Kabul the zoo in which the German zoologists worked was open. The king began to pursue the liberal policy, for example, having legalized a possibility of the women to go without burqa and having increased the rights of the personality. It led to the fact that many students began to take active part in political life. In Kabul the liberal, socialist and Maoist fractions began to be formed. In parallel, Islamic conservatives criticized the power, claiming that many settlements continue to live in poverty. In 1969 near the Mosque to Hishti's Bullet the religious revolt which protested against the influence of the Soviet Union, weakening of religion and the liberal policy began, demanding to enter back strict laws of Sharia. Demonstration was dispersed, and her leader Muhammad Faizani is arrested. In the early 70s the Kabul radio began to broadcast, besides Pashto, in other languages of ethnic minorities that they didn't feel isolated. In 1973 while Zahir Shah was on a visit in Europe, his cousin and in combination the Prime Minister of the country Muhammad Daud organized a coup, having seized power. He was supported by the NDA Marxist Party. Daud declared himself the president of the country and began political reforms. The new power began the pro-Soviet policy in the country. In 1975 young Ahmad Shah Massoud and his followers tried to organize a revolt, but were forced to flee to the neighboring Pakistan where found support from the Prime Minister of Pakistan Zulfikar Ali Bhutto who financed rebels for further destabilization of Afghanistan. Pakistan began to hire young Islamists who had to lift a mutiny in the north of Afghanistan. Among them there was also Gulbuddin Hekmatyar who will become the Prime Minister of Afghanistan subsequently. Actually, Pakistan stands at the origins of formation of future Islamism in Afghanistan as her many future leaders conducted combat training in Pakistan. In 1978 in Afghanistan there is an April Revolution as a result of which power is seized by communists. It is considered that from 1922 to 1978 in Afghanistan there was a peace period of blossoming when different ethnic groups lived in the world with each other and in the country there was an active industrialization. On April 28, 1978 the President Daud and his family together with numerous supporters were killed in Kabul. Hafizullah Amin, who begins to undertake radical reforms, comes to the power. All enterprises were nationalized on the Soviet sample. Education was also transformed on the Soviet model, where teaching Marxism-Leninism entered. And as the Marxist ideology denied religion, against her a large part of the population rebelled. Many deserted from army and joined ranks of Mujahideens. In 1979, in connection with the next appeal of Amin to the government of USSR with a request for the direction of the Soviet troops on the territory of Afghanistan in fight mines intervention from out of in internal affairs of Afghanistan, the USSR sends troops. Pakistan gave active support to Mujahideens, armed Islamists, and even organized secret operations in the territory of Afghanistan. Soon the USA, which by any method sought to prevent strengthening of influence of the Soviet Union, joined the help of Pakistan, also carrying out recruitment of new Mujahideens and Islamists. At this time in Kabul was rather peacefully, as fighting affected generally rural areas. However, in the city the threat of acts of terrorism, therefore almost at each public building military and security guards with weapons were put, was high. Murder of members of the Communist Party was quite widespread phenomenon. The city was actually turned into fortress. At the same time, economic life of the city didn't stop, and 40% of workers made then women. According to the American diplomat, contrary to official opinion, the presence of the Soviet troops piled on the agony in the city. Newcomers were generally friendly with guests and local population, often freely moved on the city and preferred shopping areas, being often bought in shops and benches. The Soviet citizens and party members built for themselves the new residential areas on the Soviet sample, consisting of a set of 5-story panel houses which stand in the city to this day. Houses where there lived military were surrounded with a barbed wire and tanks. Often most of all aggression proceeded from opponents of the mode and Mujahideens. The population promptly grew in the city. If in 1978 it was card people, then in 1988 already card. Mainly because of inflow of refugees from the neighboring Pakistan and Iran. Reorganization forced the Soviet Union to stop participation in the Afghan war. Having lost the defender, Najibullah's regime fell. In 1992, soldiers of the former Democratic Republic and multiple groups of Mujahideens with Islamists occupied the city. However, because of disagreements, they didn't manage to form new provisional government, and Kabul turned into the battlefield between groups. For 4 years 80% of buildings in the city were destroyed and 5,000 civilians died. The majority fled the city. The city suffered from regular bombings. In 1992 the system of trolleybus transport was stopped forever. In 1993 in the city the water supply system and transfer of electricity was switched completely off. The peak of tension was reached by the conflict between Shiite Hazaras, supporters Abdul Ali Mazari and Abdul Rasul Saif's Wahhabites, when the conflict already developed into ethnic cleansing. The Minister of Defense Ahmad Shah Massoud tried to mediate between groups with some success, but ceasefire remained only temporary. In June 1992 Hezbi and Wahdat and Ittihad Islami entered heavy street fighting against each other. With assistance of Saudi Arabia, Saif's forces repeatedly attacked the western suburbs of Kabul that led to the heavy victims among the civilian population. Besides, Mazari's troops were also accused of attack on civil objects in the west. Mazari recognized that he took Pashtun civilians prisoner, but protected this share, having said that Saif's forces took Hazaras the first. Mazari's group began to cooperate with Hekmatyar's group since January 1993. In 1994 the city passed under Massoud's control, and bombing stopped. His troops made an attempt of restoration of legality in Abat. Massoud tried to initiate national political process for the purpose of national consolidation and democratic elections, and also invited Talibs to them, however those refused to take part. The peace period lasted rather not for long until, as Talibs began a city siege in 1995, but Massoud's forces successfully beat off the attack. By results of a research of Amnesty International, Islamists as targets intentionally chose residential areas of the city. In 1996 Talibs made a new attempt of a siege. Massoud ordered to recede on the north, the city was taken in one day. New governors entered laws of Sharia in the city, forbade music, television, all schools for girls. Women were forbidden to work and go without burqa. At the same time Talibs didn't undertake special initiatives in restoration of the destroyed city infrastructure. The Taliban created religious police which were engaged in intimidation of local population, beating by birches of objectionable people. In October 2001 during operation in Afghanistan the American Air Forces conducted a number of bombings of the city that forced Talibs to run, and the city passed under control of NATO troops. In power there was a new government led by Hamid Karzai at the beginning of 2002. The world came to the city again, and many countries reopened the embassies. The population, as well as at the Soviet control, began to grow promptly at the expense of refugees. However, since 2001 on our time, the city periodically becomes a target of multiple terrorist attacks from Talibs, Haqqani's network, Islamic Party of Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda and other Islamist groups. Public servants and civilians become the main victims. As well as in the majority of other settlements of Afghanistan, along with number of opium plantations in the country, the level of consumption of drugs in the capital considerably grew. Special fame was gained by bridges under which there hide and live heroin addicts. Kabul continues the rapid growth of the population which generally forms chaotic low inhabited massifs, thus quickly expanding city borders. At the end of the old years, in Kabul the middle class for which began to build inhabited massifs which are carefully closed and protected began to be formed. Some of such new areas are called City of Ariya. To the area. And the Gold City. The area. Other elite areas were built in the country, such as settlement Omidisabs. The District 13. The settlement of Kasaba/Vodka Ravash. The District 15. And the settlement Sayyid Jamaluddin. The District 12. To the north from Kabul also since 2015 the ambitious project, New Kabul, the new inhabited massif on the area of 1700 acres to the north from Kabul. Areas 18 and 19 is implemented. On August 15, 2021 Talibs entered Kabul and occupied the presidential palace. Shortly before it, in the same day the former president of Afghanistan Ghani left the country and departed to Kabul has subtropical midland mountain climate. Feature of climate of Kabul are very big daily fluctuations of temperatures which are 10-15 C all the year round. Winter in Kabul rather cold, with cold nights and moderate thaw in the afternoon. The summer is hot, but at night almost always cool. The most high temperature which was registered made plus 40 C. August. The lowest 21 C. January and February. In a year 323 of rainfall drop out. All rainfall goes to the winter and spring period. In the summer and in the fall of rainfall practically doesn't happen. In the winter of drought usually often drop out in the form of snow. Before transferring Timur Shah of the capital to Kabul, the population of this city was Tajik. Tajiks made also main part of the population of Kabulistan and were natives of this area. In Kabul there were, besides, many natives of India. Even at the beginning of the 19th century, Tajiks, Kaizobash and partly Hazaras represented the main part of the population of the capital of Afghanistan. A great number of representatives of the different people lives in the city, and the national image of the city in a modern look began to be formed in the 1988 years. 3.5 million people live in the city according to approximate data. Though the Afghan state statistics underestimates this figure minus card people for 2012 a little. Most of people arrived from the neighboring provinces, escaping from fighting in the country. The most part of the population of the city is made by the Sunni-speaking Dari Tajiks, 45%, and Shiites Hazaras, 25%. The minority is made by Pashtuns, 25%, and Uzbeks, 4%. Also in the city there live natives of India, the Sikhs and Hindus speaking Indo-Aryan dialects. In the religious relation among the population of Kabul, Sunni Muslims, 75%. Prevail, Shiites make about 25%. There are also little Christian and Hindu communities. The Ministry of Finance led by Omar Zajilvil is responsible for development of economic infrastructure. In Kabul trade in fresh and dry fruit, nuts, the Afghan carpets, skins, clothes, furniture and antiquarian goods is carried out. Within reconstruction of development of economy, the World Bank allocated to Kabul $25 million. The project was closed in 2011. Also the USA allocated about $9.1 billion for development of city infrastructure. In the city also several shopping centers are constructed. Kabul city center became the first covered shopping center. In Kabul, the industrial and business region by hooks with more developed road infrastructure and the increased protection of streets is placed. There a number of the Western companies constructed the plants. The Panel Soviet House, from so-called Makrorian, in which there live representatives of the middle class. According to the international organization Transparency International, Kabul took the third place in the list of the most corrupted megalopolises in the world. It's because of incompetence of politicians the majority of investment money vanishes, investors leave the city, and many potential investors refuse to develop the business, especially from the Western countries. Only in 2012 city officials earned $3.9 billion through bribes. Districts of the city in the majority consist of clay and stone 1-2-story houses modeled in which live families. In such houses often there is no electricity and almost always a water supply system. The main problem of these buildings is that against the background of rapid growth of the population due to birth rate and migration of inhabitants from provinces, these houses can provide dense population, and the city too quickly grows in breadth. Because of bad investment climate, new buildings in the city are under construction very seldom, but even if are under construction, then with the purpose to increase population density and modernizations of the area. In 2005, the American architect of the Iranian origin Hashemachari offered the large project on full reconstruction of one of the districts of Kabul, in which it was offered to demolish completely existing constructions and on their place build 5-story buildings. Green plantings and recreational zones have to occupy a considerable part of the territory. In 2013, $1 billion was allocated for implementation of the project. During the Soviet presence in the downtown, the large residential districts consisting of 5-story panel buildings where members of the Communist Party and representatives of the middle class lodged were built. Today, in view of acute shortage of qualitative housing, the Soviet houses are in great demand. The city is divided into 22 districts. Districts consist of areas such as Kotsanga, Mervez Maidan, Dekboria, Dashtbarki, Erkan, Afshar, etc. Communication with the outside world is carried out through the international airport Kabul, which is located in 16 miles from the center of Kabul. The new international terminal of the Kabul airport was constructed through the government of Japan and began the work in 2008. The Kabul airport is also military and air base of both the Air Force of Afghanistan and forces of NATO. The most part of transport uses diesel fuel. Restoration of the trolleybus movement is planned. There are no railroads in Kabul. Trade heart of Kabul, Maivan Avenue, called so in honor of battle at the town of the same name near Kandahar, where in 1880 the English forwarding case was crushed. In the memory of this victory on the avenue, the cone-shaped tower directed up which openwork wings are trimmed by glazed tiles rises. Near Maivan Avenue, markets, such as Charchata. 4 arches, representing the whole labyrinth of very narrow small streets and lanes long since were located. Minde is considered the king of the Kabul markets. Kabal's a joke. If you didn't find something to Minde, so she doesn't exist in the world at all. Also far. Write comments. Read comments. Interesting people will tell interesting stories. All of good mood and good luck.